Every afternoon, at exactly 4 o'clock, an elderly woman prepared 2 cups of tea. One was hers. The other belonged to someone who hadn't walked through that cafe door in 34 years. Yet every day, she still waited. And then, one spring afternoon, a little girl finally asked the question no one else ever had. There was a quiet village called Ashcombe where life seemed to move at the pace of the river that curved gently around its stone cottages. Every morning began with the sound of birds greeting the sunrise from the willow trees. By afternoon, sunlight shimmered across the water while ducks drifted lazily beneath the old stone bridge. In the evenings, warm golden light spilled from cottage windows, and the scent of freshly baked bread mingled with the cool breeze that wandered through the narrow lanes. It was the sort of place where nothing appeared to change. Yet every village has its small mysteries. Ashcombe had one that everyone noticed but almost no one spoke about. On the edge of the river stood a little café called Riverside Café. It wasn't the largest building in the village, nor the oldest, but it had a way of making anyone who entered feel as though they had stepped into another time. Its windows were framed with climbing roses that bloomed from spring until autumn. Copper kettles rested on polished wooden shelves. The fireplace crackled gently whenever the evenings turned cool. The air always carried the comforting aroma of fresh scones, homemade jam, cinnamon, and tea leaves steeping in old porcelain pots. Visitors often said they could smell the cafe long before they reached its blue-painted door. The owner was Margaret Ellis. At 71 years old, Margaret had silver hair gathered into a neat bun and gentle eyes that always seemed to notice when someone needed kindness before they spoke a single word. She remembered everyone's favorite tea. She remembered birthdays. She remembered which chair every regular preferred. And she always smiled as though she genuinely had all the time in the world. But there was one habit that puzzled every newcomer. Every afternoon, as the church clock prepared to strike 4, Margaret carefully arranged 2 places at the small table beside the window overlooking the river. 2 delicate porcelain cups. 2 matching saucers. 2 teaspoons resting perfectly beside folded linen napkins. A tiny vase holding fresh flowers picked from the garden behind the cafe. Then she poured tea into both cups. Only one was ever touched. The other remained untouched until sunset. Not once had anyone ever seen another person sit in the empty chair. Day after day. Month after month. Year after year. The regular customers noticed it so often that they eventually stopped wondering. Benjamin, the old fisherman, simply nodded whenever Margaret carried the second cup to the window. Grace, the retired schoolteacher, continued reading her novels without looking up. Oliver, the young baker who delivered warm scones every morning, quietly placed the basket on the counter and smiled as though the empty chair belonged there as naturally as the fireplace. No one asked. Not because they weren't curious. Because something about Margaret's quiet ritual felt deserving of respect. Some mysteries, they believed, belonged only to the person carrying them. Margaret never explained. She simply straightened the empty chair each afternoon, smoothed the tablecloth with gentle hands, and gazed through the window toward the slow-moving river. Sometimes she smiled. Sometimes she seemed lost in memories that no one else could see. And just before the church bell rang 6, she carried away the untouched cup, washed it carefully, polished the spoon until it shone, and prepared the cafe for another day. It was a routine so ordinary that it became part of Ashcombe itself. Children grew up believing every cafe served 2 cups of tea. Visitors occasionally asked questions. The villagers only smiled. That's simply how Margaret has always done things. One warm spring afternoon, however, someone new walked through the blue door. Someone who had never seen the empty chair before. And unlike everyone else, she wasn't afraid to ask why. The small brass bell above the cafe door chimed softly as the newest visitor stepped inside. She couldn't have been older than 8. Golden curls peeked from beneath a straw hat that seemed a little too large for her, and she carried a sketchbook tucked tightly beneath one arm. Her name was Emma. She had recently moved to Ashcombe with her parents after her father accepted work restoring the old mill by the river. Everything in the village fascinated her. The ducks that gathered beneath the bridge. The flower baskets hanging from every lamp post. The scent of fresh bread drifting from Oliver's bakery. Even the church bell that echoed gently across the valley. Margaret welcomed her with the same warm smile she offered everyone. "Good afternoon." Emma smiled back. "My mother said you make the best hot chocolate in the village." Margaret laughed softly. "Your mother has excellent taste." A few minutes later, Emma settled beside the window with a steaming mug topped with whipped cream and a dusting of cocoa. She opened her sketchbook and began drawing the river outside. Then, the church clock struck 4. Emma watched Margaret carry a silver tray toward the empty table. 2 cups. 2 saucers. Fresh flowers. The tea steamed gently in the afternoon sunlight. Emma looked around the cafe. Only 1 chair was occupied. She waited. Surely someone would arrive. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Finally, she walked over to Margaret. "Excuse me." Margaret turned with her usual smile. "Yes." Emma pointed toward the untouched cup. "Is someone late?" The cafe fell unusually quiet. Benjamin looked over the rim of his newspaper. Grace lowered her book just enough to listen. Oliver paused while arranging fresh scones behind the counter. Margaret followed Emma's gaze toward the empty chair. Then smiled gently. "No." Emma tilted her head. "Then why do you make tea for someone who isn't here?" Margaret looked out toward the river. "Because sometimes." She paused. "Hope likes to keep a place at the table." Emma didn't fully understand. But somehow, the answer felt too beautiful to question. Before the first birds welcomed the dawn, Oliver was already awake. The village baker believed that bread carried the mood of the hands that made it. So every morning, he worked quietly, never rushing, never speaking loudly. Only the gentle rhythm of kneading dough filled the bakery. By 7 o'clock, baskets of warm scones and buttery pastries filled the shelves. Margaret's order always came first. Not because she asked. Because it had always been that way. Oliver carried the basket along the riverside path as the morning mist floated above the water. When he entered the cafe, Margaret was polishing teacups. "Morning, Oliver." "Morning." He placed the basket on the counter. As he turned to leave, his eyes wandered toward the little table beside the window. Even in the early morning, the second chair had already been straightened. The flowers had already been replaced. Margaret noticed him looking. "You've always wondered, haven't you?" Oliver smiled. "Since I was a boy. And yet you've never asked." He shrugged. "I suppose I thought, if you wanted us to know, you'd tell us." Margaret nodded with quiet appreciation. "There are some stories," she said softly, "that only become ready when someone needs to hear them." Oliver left with those words echoing gently in his thoughts. Outside, the river flowed peacefully toward the sea. Some stories, it seemed, moved just as slowly that afternoon. Rain drifted softly across Ashcombe. Not enough to keep people indoors. Just enough to make the windows glow a little warmer. Benjamin arrived first, carrying the day's catch wrapped neatly in cloth. Grace followed with another thick novel tucked beneath her arm. Oliver stopped in briefly after closing the bakery. Each greeted Margaret. Each settled into familiar routines. Then, as always, the church bell rang 4 times. Margaret prepared 2 cups of tea. Emma watched more closely than before. She noticed every little detail. Margaret warmed both cups before pouring the tea. She arranged the spoons so they pointed in exactly the same direction. She straightened the empty chair ever so slightly. Then she placed 1 tiny white daisy into the vase. Not a rose. Not lavender. Always a daisy. Emma whispered to Grace. "Why that flower?" Grace smiled without looking away from her book. "I've never asked." "You don't want to know?" "Oh, I do." She closed the book gently. "But sometimes, the waiting is part of the story." Emma looked back toward Margaret. The older woman had taken her usual seat behind the counter. She wasn't watching the cafe. She was watching the river beyond the window. As though she expected someone to appear around the bend at any moment. Outside, a narrow wooden rowing boat drifted slowly downstream. For just a heartbeat, Margaret smiled. Not because she recognized the boat, but because hope, even after all these years, still found its way into her afternoon. Emma quietly picked up her pencil. Instead of drawing the river, she drew the empty chair. Somehow, it felt like the most important seat in the whole village. By the time May arrived, the river had become the brightest place in Ashcombe. Wildflowers lined its banks. Willow branches brushed the water whenever the breeze wandered through the valley. The cafe windows stood open from morning until evening, allowing birdsong and the scent of fresh blossoms to drift inside. Every afternoon, just before Margaret prepared the second cup of tea, music floated across the river. A violin. Soft. Patient. Never hurried. Emma heard it first. She looked toward the opposite bank. A young man sat beneath an old willow tree, his violin resting gently beneath his chin. His melody wasn't meant for an audience. It felt more like a conversation with the afternoon itself. Margaret paused while placing the flowers on the empty table. She closed her eyes for a moment. When the music ended, she smiled. Benjamin noticed. "I've never seen you smile quite like that." Margaret looked toward the river. Some songs remember people. Benjamin didn't ask another question. He simply nodded and returned to his tea. Outside, the violinist packed away his instrument and disappeared along the riverside path, leaving only silence behind. Yet somehow, the cafe still seemed filled with music. The following morning, Emma wandered through the cafe while Margaret prepared fresh scones. She admired the old teapots, the polished wooden shelves, the tiny jars filled with homemade jam. Then something caught her eye. High above the fireplace stood a small framed photograph. It showed a much younger Margaret. Beside her stood a smiling young man wearing a wool coat. Behind them, the very same cafe. Only the climbing roses were much smaller. Emma carried the photograph carefully to the counter. "Who's this?" Margaret looked at the picture for a long time. His name was Daniel. "Were you married?" Margaret smiled warmly. "We were going to be." Emma waited quietly. "What happened?" Margaret gently returned the photograph to its place. "Life asked us to wait. No sadness. No bitterness. Only quiet acceptance." Emma sensed there was much more to the story. But she also understood. Some memories bloom slowly, just like roses. Rain arrived without warning. Tiny drops danced across the cafe windows, turning the river into shimmering silver. It should have been a quiet day. Instead, nearly every table was occupied. A young mother warming her hands around tea. An elderly couple sharing apple cake. Oliver escaping the rain with a basket of fresh bread. Benjamin drying his fishing hat beside the fire. The cafe felt wonderfully alive. Emma watched Margaret moving from table to table. She remembered every order. Every name. Every favorite pastry. No one left unnoticed. Then, the church bell struck 4. As always, Margaret carried 2 cups of tea to the little table beside the window. One remained untouched. A little boy at a nearby table whispered to his father, "Who's coming?" His father smiled. "I don't know. But I think the chair helps people remember that there's always room for one more." Emma looked again at the empty place. For the first time, she wondered if the chair wasn't waiting for someone specific. Perhaps it was waiting for anyone who needed it. The thought stayed with her long after the rain stopped. Late one afternoon, an old wooden rowing boat drifted slowly toward the riverbank outside the cafe. Its owner was an elderly boatman named Henry. Every Wednesday, he tied his little boat beneath the willow tree before stepping inside for tea. Margaret greeted him with the familiarity reserved for old friends. "The river was kind today." Henry smiled. "It always is, if you don't rush it." Emma watched them talking. "You've known each other a long time?" Henry chuckled. "Long enough to remember when this cafe had only 3 tables." Margaret laughed softly. "And a leaky roof." Henry looked toward the empty chair beside the window. "It still waits." Margaret nodded. "It always will." Henry turned to Emma. "When I was your age, I thought that chair belonged to one person. And now?" He smiled toward the river. "Now I think it belongs to hope itself." Outside, the evening sun painted the water with ribbons of gold. Henry climbed back into his boat and pushed gently away from the shore. Emma stood at the window watching him disappear around the bend. Then she looked back at the empty chair. For the first time, she smiled at it. Not because she understood its story, but because she had begun to feel what it meant. The following Tuesday began like every other. The cafe filled with the gentle clinking of porcelain cups. Fresh scones cooled on the windowsill. The scent of Earl Grey drifted through the room. Emma arrived after school carrying another drawing. This one showed the cafe beside the river. But something had changed. She had drawn two people sitting at the table by the window. Margaret studied the picture. They look happy. Emma nodded. I thought maybe the empty chair shouldn't always be empty. Margaret smiled softly. It wasn't always. Emma's eyes widened. It wasn't. Margaret carefully folded the drawing and placed it beside the register. Many years ago. That was the busiest table in the cafe. Emma leaned forward. Who sat there? Margaret looked toward the river. A young man named Daniel. The name settled gently between them. He always arrived exactly at 4. He said afternoon tea tasted better when the sunlight touched the river. Emma imagined it. The laughter. The warm cups. The tiny vase of flowers. For the first time, the empty chair no longer felt lonely. It felt remembered. That evening the rain returned. Soft drops tapped against the cafe windows while the fire crackled quietly. Most customers had gone home. Only Emma remained, helping Margaret dry teacups. Did Daniel like tea? She asked. Margaret laughed. He claimed he didn't. Emma frowned. Then why did he come every day? Because. Margaret smiled at the memory. He said tea was never the reason. It wasn't. No. He came because he enjoyed watching people. The children feeding ducks. The old fisherman telling impossible stories. The schoolteacher pretending not to laugh. And me. Margaret looked into the dancing firelight. One autumn afternoon, he took my hand. And he said, no matter where life takes me, save me a place by the window. One day I'll come back. And we'll watch the river grow old together. Emma whispered. Did he leave? Margaret nodded. He had to. But promises. She gently placed another log on the fire. Have a funny way of staying long after footsteps disappear. The next morning Oliver arrived carrying more than fresh scones. He held a small wooden box. I found this while helping repair the old attic. Margaret looked at it with surprise. She hadn't seen the box in years. Inside lay dozens of neatly tied letters, each wrapped in faded blue ribbon. Emma looked at them curiously. Did Daniel write these? Margaret nodded. He wrote whenever he could. Did you answer? Every one. Emma noticed something unusual. None of the envelopes had stamps. They were never posted. Margaret smiled. They didn't need to be. Oliver looked puzzled. Margaret lifted one letter carefully. We lived in the same village. He delivered them himself. Every Sunday. Emma laughed. So he wrote letters, even though he could have simply walked here? Margaret nodded. He believed some words deserved paper. She unfolded one page. The ink had faded, but the handwriting remained steady. Dear Margaret. If I ever become too busy to notice the river, please remind me to come home. Margaret quietly folded the letter again. He always remembered. Friday evening arrived beneath a sky painted in soft shades of gold and pink. The cafe glowed warmly against the riverside. Every table was filled. Benjamin shared stories beside the fire. Grace smiled over another well-loved novel. Oliver served warm blackberry scones. Emma sat beside the window, watching, waiting. At exactly 4 o'clock, Margaret carried 2 cups of tea, placed them gently on the table, straightened the flowers, then quietly sat opposite the empty chair. She didn't speak. She simply smiled. The cafe became wonderfully still. No one interrupted. No one hurried. Even the river seemed to slow. Emma suddenly realized something. Margaret wasn't waiting because she believed yesterday would return. She wasn't trapped by the past. She was honoring a love that had shaped every kindness she offered today. The empty chair wasn't asking someone to come back. It was reminding everyone already there, never to take the people beside them for granted. Outside, the evening sun shimmered across the river. Inside, 2 cups of tea slowly cooled together. And for the first time, Emma no longer wondered who the second cup belonged to. She understood it belonged to a promise that kindness had kept alive for decades. The river moved quietly beneath the old stone bridge, just as it had every spring for as long as anyone could remember. Margaret stood beside the open cafe window, watching sunlight dance across the water. Emma noticed her smile. It was a day like this, wasn't it? Margaret nodded. The very last afternoon before Daniel left. The cafe had looked much the same back then. The same wooden floor. The same little brass bell above the door. Even the roses had climbed around the windows, though they had been younger, just beginning to bloom. Daniel arrived exactly as he always did. 4 o'clock. Not a minute early. Not a minute late. He carried a small paper parcel beneath his arm. "For you," he said. Margaret laughed. "You know I told you not to bring gifts." "It isn't a gift." "What is it?" "A reason to smile when I'm away." Inside the parcel was a tiny porcelain teacup. Delicate blue flowers circled its rim. On the bottom were 4 simple words. "Until tea together again." Margaret still owned that cup. It rested quietly on the highest shelf in the cafe. Never used. Never forgotten. "It reminds me," she whispered, "that some promises can stay warm long after the tea has gone cold." The next morning, Emma arrived carrying a small wooden stool. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "And what's that for?" Emma pointed toward the highest shelf. "I'd like to see the teacup." Margaret smiled. "You have very determined eyes." Together they climbed carefully. Margaret lifted the tiny porcelain cup into her hands. Time had faded the blue flowers only slightly. There wasn't a single crack. Emma turned it over. There they were. The 4 words. "Until tea together again." It must be very special. Margaret nodded. "It reminds me not only of Daniel, but of the life we dreamed about." Emma looked around the cafe. "I think you built that life anyway." Margaret paused. She had never thought of it quite like that. Perhaps Emma was right. The laughter. The friendships. The warm afternoons. The welcome offered to strangers. Maybe the cafe had become the dream. Just in a different way than either of them had imagined. Late that afternoon, the young traveler who had been staying at the village inn stepped into the cafe once again. This time he carried an old leather journal. "I hoped you might recognize this." Margaret accepted it gently. The cover was worn smooth by years of careful hands. She opened the first page. Immediately she recognized the handwriting. Daniel's. Her breath caught. The traveler spoke softly. "My grandfather gave this to my father. My father gave it to me. He told me if I ever visited Ashcombe, I should bring it here." Margaret carefully turned each page. There were sketches of the river, the bridge, the cafe, pressed wildflowers, little notes describing afternoons spent watching the sunlight on the water. Then she reached the final pages. One sentence had been written in darker ink. "If life changes our plans, may kindness become the place where we meet again." Margaret gently closed the journal. She held it close to her heart. Not because it answered every question, but because it reminded her that love had never truly left the cafe. It had simply changed its form that Friday. Something felt different. The cafe hummed with its familiar warmth. Benjamin laughed louder than usual. Grace finally reached the last page of her novel. Oliver carried in a basket of warm cinnamon buns. Emma placed fresh daisies into the little vase. Then, as the church bell struck 4, Margaret prepared the 2 cups of tea. She carried them to the window, placed one before her chair, the other before the empty seat. She stood quietly for a moment. Then she did something no one had ever seen before. She turned to the room and smiled. If anyone ever finds themselves with nowhere to sit, this table is always waiting. The cafe became wonderfully still. Benjamin looked at Grace. Grace smiled at Oliver. Emma's face lit up. No one rushed to take the chair. That wasn't the point. The invitation itself changed the room. The empty seat was no longer only part of Margaret's story. It had become part of Ashcombe's. Outside, the river continued its slow journey toward the sea. Inside, the afternoon sunlight settled gently across the two teacups. One filled with memories. The other, filled with possibility. Saturday arrived wrapped in soft sunshine. The river sparkled beneath the old stone bridge, and the willow branches swayed gently in the morning breeze. By midday, Riverside Café was filled with its usual rhythm. The gentle clink of teacups. The smell of freshly baked scones. The quiet murmur of familiar conversations. Emma was helping Margaret arrange flowers when the café door opened. A young woman stepped inside, carrying a small travel bag. She hesitated near the entrance, looking around as though unsure whether she belonged. Margaret noticed immediately. She always noticed. "Good afternoon," she said warmly. "You look as though you've had a long journey." The young woman smiled politely. "I've been traveling since dawn. Please." Margaret gestured toward the room. "Sit wherever you like." The woman looked around. Every table was occupied. Every chair. Except one. The chair beside the window. She pointed toward it. "May I?" Margaret looked at the empty place setting. The fresh flowers. The second cup waiting patiently. Then she smiled. "Yes." The café grew wonderfully quiet. Benjamin lowered his newspaper. Grace looked over her glasses. Oliver paused halfway through slicing warm bread. Emma watched with wide eyes. The young woman sat carefully. Margaret poured fresh tea into the second cup. No one spoke. Not because the moment was sad. Because everyone understood that something gentle had just changed. The empty chair had finally welcomed someone. Exactly as it had always been meant to. That evening, after the last customer had gone home, Emma remained behind to help Margaret close the café. As they stacked chairs and polished teacups, Emma asked quietly, "Were you happy today?" Margaret smiled. "I was." "Didn't it feel strange seeing someone else in that chair?" Margaret looked toward the window. "It felt right." Emma frowned. "I thought the chair belonged to Daniel." Margaret shook her head gently. "No. It belonged to a promise." She walked over to the old photograph resting above the fireplace. "You see, Daniel once told me something." Emma waited. "He said, love isn't measured by how long someone stays beside you. It's measured by what it teaches you after they're gone." Margaret's eyes drifted toward the quiet river. "For many years, I thought keeping the chair empty was how I honored him." She smiled softly. "But today I realized. He would have wanted someone to sit there." Emma nodded slowly. "So the promise changed." Margaret smiled. "No. I finally understood it." Outside, the first evening stars appeared above Ashcombe. The café windows reflected the warm glow of the lanterns inside. For the first time in many years, the room somehow felt lighter. Word spread quietly through Ashcombe. Not through gossip. Through kindness. People began noticing that no one ever sat alone in Riverside Café anymore. If a traveler arrived without company, someone would wave them over. If an elderly neighbor came in looking tired, the chair by the window was waiting. If a visitor looked uncertain, Margaret would simply smile and say, "There's always room at this table." Soon, it became something of a tradition. Not one written in books. Not one announced with signs. Just something people did. Benjamin invited a widower who had recently moved into the village to share afternoon tea. Grace welcomed a young teacher on her first day in Ashcombe. Oliver brought warm cinnamon buns for anyone sitting at the window. Emma began leaving little drawings beneath the vase of fresh daisies. One afternoon, Margaret noticed something that made her stop. The chair by the window was occupied. Not by one person, but by laughter. By conversation. By strangers becoming friends. She looked toward the river. The afternoon sun shimmered on the water just as it had all those years ago. Quietly, almost as though speaking to the breeze, she whispered, "Thank you, Daniel." The river carried her words gently downstream. And somewhere in the peaceful silence of Ashcombe, it almost felt as though they had been heard. Autumn arrived quietly in Ashcombe. The willow leaves turned shades of gold and amber, drifting gently onto the river where they floated beneath the old stone bridge before disappearing around the bend. The air grew cooler. The mornings became softer. And the village began preparing for its annual autumn festival. 4 generations, the celebration had marked the changing of the seasons. Children gathered baskets of apples from the orchards beyond the hills. Oliver filled his bakery with cinnamon loaves, honey cakes, and buttery pastries. Benjamin decorated the riverbank with tiny lanterns that would glow after sunset. Grace spent afternoons helping the children rehearse songs they would sing beneath the great oak tree. Margaret watched it all from the doorway of Riverside Café. The village had always loved this season. Daniel had loved it most of all. Emma skipped into the cafe carrying a bundle of orange and crimson leaves. I thought we could decorate the windows. Margaret smiled. I think Daniel would have liked that. Together they arranged autumn leaves around the cafe, weaving them between little bunches of dried lavender and tiny white daisies. By late afternoon, Riverside Café glowed with the warm colors of the season. As the church clock struck 4, Margaret prepared 2 cups of tea. She placed them beside the window as she always had. But this time, the second chair did not remain empty for long. An elderly traveler paused outside, peering uncertainly through the window. Margaret caught his eye. Without saying a word, she smiled and gently gestured toward the chair. The man stepped inside. I hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all, Margaret replied. I believe this seat has been waiting for you. He sat carefully beside the window, warming his hands around the steaming cup. Outside, children laughed as leaves danced across the cobblestones. Inside, the little cafe felt warmer than ever. Emma looked at Margaret. She understood now. The chair had never belonged to one person. It belonged to anyone who needed to feel welcomed. A few mornings later, Margaret arrived before sunrise. The cafe was still. The river rested beneath a blanket of mist. She climbed the narrow staircase leading to the small room above the kitchen. There, inside an old oak cupboard, rested a weathered leather recipe book. Its pages had yellowed with time. The corners were worn smooth from years of loving hands. Emma arrived just as Margaret carried it downstairs. Is that your recipe book? Margaret nodded. It was ours. She opened the first page. Written neatly beneath the title were 2 names. Daniel and Margaret. Emma smiled. You baked together? Oh, yes. Margaret laughed softly. He wasn't very good at measuring flour. But he insisted every recipe needed 1 extra ingredient. What was it? Margaret turned another page. Tucked between the recipes was a folded note written in Daniel's familiar handwriting. A good cafe doesn't become special because of perfect cakes or fine tea. It becomes special because someone walks in feeling alone and leaves believing they have friends. Emma read the words twice, then quietly looked around the cafe. Benjamin laughing near the fire. Grace recommending another book to a visitor. Oliver delivering fresh bread with his usual cheerful smile. She realized Daniel's recipe had worked. Not only for cakes, but for the entire village. Margaret carefully closed the book. I think it's time someone else learned these recipes. Emma looked surprised. You mean? Margaret smiled warmly. If you'd like to. Emma's eyes shone brighter than the morning sunlight spilling through the windows. I'd love to. The evening before the festival came to an end, the villagers gathered along the riverbank. It was an old Ashcombe tradition. Each family carried a small paper lantern. Inside every lantern burned a single gentle candle. One by one, they placed them upon the slow-moving river. The lanterns drifted quietly beneath the bridge, their reflections dancing across the water like tiny golden stars. Margaret stood beside Emma, holding a lantern of her own. Emma looked up. Who is yours for? Margaret smiled toward the glowing river. For everyone who helped us become who we are. Emma thought carefully before answering. Then mine is for people I haven't met yet. Margaret looked at her with quiet admiration. I think that's a beautiful choice. Together they released their lanterns. They floated side by side, carried gently by the current. No one hurried to speak. No one wished to disturb the peaceful silence. Across the river, the lights of Riverside Café shimmered warmly through its windows. The chair beside the window could still be seen, occupied now by two travelers sharing tea and conversation. Margaret smiled to herself. The promise had become something far greater than waiting. It had become belonging. And as the last lantern disappeared around the bend, Ashcombe settled into another peaceful evening, wrapped in kindness, friendship, and the quiet comfort of knowing there would always be a place waiting for anyone who needed one. Winter arrived gently in Ashcombe. The first frost painted silver patterns across the cafe windows each morning, while smoke curled lazily from cottage chimneys into the pale blue sky. Inside Riverside Café, nothing ever felt cold. The fireplace glowed warmly. Fresh bread cooled upon the counter. The scent of cinnamon, honey, and tea welcomed every visitor through the blue-painted door. Margaret still opened the cafe before sunrise. She still polished every teacup by hand. She still placed fresh flowers on the table beside the window. But now, there were no longer two untouched cups. There were simply two cups waiting for whoever needed company that afternoon. Sometimes the chair was taken by a traveler. Sometimes by a widow who missed conversation. Sometimes by a young carpenter new to the village. Sometimes by children sharing stories after school. The chair was never empty for long. One snowy afternoon, Emma arrived carrying a small wooden sign she had carved herself. I made something. Margaret examined it carefully. The lettering was beautifully simple. No one drinks tea alone. Margaret smiled, her eyes glistening in the firelight. Would you like to hang it? Emma nodded eagerly. Together they fastened it beside the window where everyone could see it. Benjamin adjusted his spectacles and chuckled. I think Daniel would approve. Grace closed her book with a gentle smile. I think he'd order another pot of tea. Laughter drifted through the cafe. Outside, snowflakes settled softly along the riverside. Inside, the warmth seemed to grow with every conversation. Margaret looked at the little sign. For many years she had believed she was keeping a promise. Now she understood something even more beautiful. Promises aren't only kept by remembering. Sometimes, they're kept by sharing. She poured another cup of tea. A young traveler entered, stamping the snow from his boots. Margaret looked toward the chair beside the window. It's waiting for you. The traveler smiled with grateful surprise. I was hoping I wouldn't have to drink alone. You never will, Margaret replied. And somehow, the cafe felt exactly as it had all those years ago. Not because the past had returned, but because kindness had quietly found a new home. Years passed as quietly as the river beyond the cafe windows. The roses climbed a little higher each spring. The willow tree grew broader with every season. Children became parents. Visitors became neighbors. Strangers became friends. Emma grew older, too. She learned every recipe in the worn leather book. She baked Daniel's favorite apple cake. She brewed Margaret's favorite afternoon tea. And every morning before opening the cafe, she placed fresh flowers on the table beside the window. Not because someone had asked her to. Because it simply felt right. One peaceful evening, long after the last customer had gone home, Margaret and Emma stood outside Riverside Café together. The sun slipped slowly behind the hills, painting the river in shades of amber and gold. Lanterns began to glow along the old stone bridge. The windows of the cafe shone warmly against the gathering dusk. Emma looked toward the little table. It isn't really about the chair anymore, is it? Margaret smiled. It never was. Emma looked puzzled. It was always about making sure that no one who walked through that door felt forgotten. They stood quietly for a while, listening to the gentle current of the river. Then Margaret spoke once more. When people remember this cafe, I hope they don't remember me. I hope they remember how they felt while they were here. Emma slipped her hand gently into Margaret's. I think they will. A robin settled upon the fence outside the garden. The church bell rang softly in the distance. The lights inside Riverside Café glowed like a quiet welcome against the evening sky. And somewhere, perhaps carried by the river itself, it seemed as though Daniel's promise had finally reached its destination. Not in one chair, not in one cup of tea, but in every smile shared across that little table beside the window. Because home is not always the place where we begin. Sometimes, home is simply the place where someone remembers to leave a chair waiting for us. The river flowed on. The lanterns shone. The cafe door remained open until sunset. And every afternoon, another story quietly began over a warm cup of tea. Thank you for spending this peaceful evening in Ashcombe. May your heart feel a little lighter. May your thoughts become a little quieter. And wherever tomorrow finds you, may you always discover a place where kindness keeps a seat waiting. Good night. Sleep well. Until we meet again in another Moonlight Tales story.